Sometimes when life takes everything from you, all you have left is your word and the courage to keep it. Sarah McKinnon learned this the hard way when her husband died, leaving her alone with a ranch she couldn't run and debts she couldn't pay. In desperation, she made a bold promise to the whole town of Cedar Ridge. Any man who could tame Thunder, her late husband's wild mustang, could have her hand in marriage and the ranch that came with it. Rich men came from far and wide, thinking money could buy them both horse and bride. But Thunder threw every single one of them into the dust. Then one morning, a poor cowboy with nothing but worn boots and gentle hands walked up to her gate. He didn't have a dollar to his name, but something in his quiet way made Thunder's ears twitch with interest instead of anger. The whole town gathered to watch, whispering that this penniless drifter would be just another failure. What they witnessed that day would become the greatest love story Cedar Ridge had ever seen. But what secret did this mysterious cowboy carry that allowed him to succeed where all the wealthy men had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McKinnon ranch as Sarah stood at her kitchen window, absently fingering the gold wedding ring that hung from a delicate chain around her neck. 3 months had passed since Thomas drew his last breath in the bed they'd shared for 7 years, and still she couldn't bring herself to remove the symbol of their love from her body entirely. Yet wearing it on her finger felt like a lie now, a promise to a future that would never come. The ranch spread out before her like a testament to dreams deferred. Thomas had built every fence post with his own hands, cleared every acre of sagebrush and stone, and shaped this wild Montana territory into something resembling civilization. The 2-story farmhouse with its wraparound porch had been his wedding gift to her, complete with carved shutters and a root cellar that stayed cool even in the harshest summer heat. Now it felt like a mausoleum, too large for one person and too quiet for comfort. Sarah poured herself another cup of coffee from the blue enamel pot on the wood-burning stove, the same pot Thomas had brought her from town on their first anniversary. Everything in this house carried his memory like dust, settling into corners she couldn't quite reach. The oak dining table bore the ring stains from his whiskey glass. The leather chair by the fireplace still held the impression of his body. Even the books on the shelf, mostly practical volumes, about cattle ranching and veterinary, spoke of a man who planned for a future he wouldn't live to see. At 28, Sarah McKinnon possessed the kind of beauty that came from hard work and honest living. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, though she wore it pulled back in a practical bun more often than not. Her hands, once soft from her privileged upbringing in St. Louis, now bore the calluses of ranch work and the small scars that came from learning to mend fence and birth calves. Her green eyes, which Thomas used to say reminded him of spring grass after rain, had taken on a harder quality since his passing, the look of a woman who'd learned not to expect mercy from the world. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road leading to her property pulled her from her reverie. Through the window, she could see Reverend Walsh approaching on his bay mare, his black coat flapping behind him like the wings of some enormous crow. Sarah knew why he was coming. The whole town of Cedar Ridge had been talking about nothing else for weeks. Cedar Ridge itself was the kind of frontier town that existed more out of stubbornness than prosperity. Nestled in a valley between 2 ranges of mountains, it boasted a population of perhaps 300 souls on a good day when the ranchers came in from the surrounding territory. Main Street consisted of a general store, a saloon called the Lucky Dollar, a blacksmith shop, the church where Reverend Walsh held services twice a week, and a handful of other businesses that served the needs of cattlemen and their families. The people of Cedar Ridge were the sort who helped their neighbors bring in hay before a storm and asked no questions when a man showed up with more horses than he could reasonably afford. They minded their own business until someone made their business, the town's business, which was exactly what Sarah had done 3 weeks ago when she'd stood on the church steps after Sunday service and made her desperate announcement. Thomas McKinnon had left his wife more than a ranch and a house full of memories. He'd left her debt that stretched from the bank in Cedar Ridge all the way to creditors in Helena and Billings. The drought of the previous summer had killed most of their cattle, and the harsh winter that followed had taken most of the rest. What few had remained weren't nearly enough to cover the loans Thomas had taken to improve the property and expand the herd. Sarah had discovered all of this in the days following the funeral, when men in neat suits began appearing at her door with papers that needed signing and debts that needed settling. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt. The bank held notes on everything from the livestock to the furniture in the parlor. Even Thunder, Thomas's prized Mustang stallion, was technically owned by the First Bank of Cedar Ridge as collateral against a loan her husband had taken to buy breeding stock that had never arrived due to a dishonest horse trader in Wyoming. Thunder himself was both the symbol of Thomas's dreams and the embodiment of his wild spirit. The stallion stood 17 hands high, coal black except for a white blaze that ran from his forehead to his muzzle like a bolt of lightning frozen in time. Thomas had found him as a yearling, half dead from starvation and abuse, abandoned by some traveling horse trader who'd probably stolen him from a crow hunting party. It had taken Thomas 6 months to gain the horse's trust and another year to break him to saddle, though break was perhaps the wrong word. Thunder had never been broken, merely convinced to cooperate. Since Thomas's death, Thunder had become increasingly wild, refusing to let anyone approach his corral, much less mount him. He'd kicked down 2 fence panels and bitten the Mexican hired hand, Miguel, badly enough to require stitches. The horse seemed to understand that his master was gone and had no intention of accepting a replacement. Reverend Walsh dismounted at the hitching post near Sarah's front porch and tied his mare with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent most of his 60 years in the saddle. He was a thin, weathered man with kind eyes and hands that spoke of hard work despite his calling. Before finding God and the ministry, he'd been a soldier in the war between the states, and before that, a cowboy himself. He understood the language of this country and the people who chose to make their lives in it. "Morning, Sarah," he called as he approached the house. "Might we have a word?" She opened the door before he could knock, as was the custom in this part of the world, where isolation made hospitality a necessity rather than a nicety. "Reverend Walsh, coffee's hot if you'd like some." "Much obliged." He removed his black hat and followed her into the kitchen, where she poured him a cup from the blue enamel pot. They sat across from each other at the oak table, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that existed between people who'd known each other long enough to understand that some conversations required careful approaching. "The town's been talking," Reverend Walsh finally said, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm cup. "I imagine they have." Sarah's voice carried a note of resignation rather than defensiveness. She'd expected this conversation since the morning she'd made her announcement. "Some folks think you've taken leave of your senses. Others think you're being practical in your own way." He took a sip of coffee and studied her face over the rim of the cup. "What I think is that you're a woman backed into a corner, trying to find a way out that doesn't involve losing everything Thomas worked to build." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but blinked them back. She'd cried enough in the past 3 months to last a lifetime, and tears wouldn't save the ranch or pay the debts. "The bank's given me until the end of the month. After that, they'll foreclose on everything, Thunder included. And you figure if some man can tame Thunder, he'll be man enough to take on the debts and the ranch too." Something like that. She stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the corral where Thunder paced restlessly, his black coat gleaming in the morning sun. Thomas always said Thunder would only accept a man who understood him, not one who tried to dominate him. Maybe the same principle applies to marriage. Reverend Walsh chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "That's either the wisest thing I've heard in months or the most foolish. Time will tell which. 5 men have tried so far," Sarah continued, not turning from the window. 5 men with more money than sense, thinking they could buy their way into Thunder's good graces with expensive equipment and rough handling. She remembered each attempt with crystalline clarity. First had been Marcus Whitmore, who owned the largest spread in the county. He'd arrived with silver spurs and a Mexican vaqueros riata, convinced that Thunder simply needed to be shown who was boss. Thunder had thrown him so hard that Marcus had limped for a week afterward. Then came Jonathan Hartwell from back east, a railroad man who'd made his fortune in steel and had ideas about scientific horse training involving restraints and forced submission. Thunder had broken free of his contraptions and chased Jonathan clear out of the corral, tearing his expensive coat to ribbons in the process. The other three attempts had followed similar pattern-swelthy men with big ideas and bigger egos, all of whom discovered that Thunder couldn't be bought, bullied, or broken by conventional means. Each failure had drawn larger crowds from town, turning Sarah's desperate gamble into something approaching entertainment. She wasn't sure which was worse, the humiliation of having her private business become public spectacle, or the growing certainty that no man would ever succeed in taming her husband's horse. "There's been talk of another man," Reverend Walsh said quietly. "Stranger who rode into town yesterday evening, took a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, paid in advance with silver coins." Sarah turned from the window, curiosity flickering in her green eyes. "What sort of man?" "The quiet sort, not young, but not old either, maybe 35, 40 years. Rides a paint horse that's seen better days, but the animal's well cared for. Clean tack, good boots, hat that's been shaped by weather but not neglect. Miguel saw him at the general store buying supplies, nothing fancy, just coffee and beans and a few other staples." "Did he ask about the challenge?" "Not directly, but Mrs. Henderson says he asked about you, wanted to know about Thomas, about the ranch, about Thunder, asked questions like a man who's thinking serious thoughts." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, hope perhaps, or maybe just the familiar anxiety that came with each new challenger. What did she tell him? The truth, knowing Martha Henderson, that Thomas was a good man who died too young, that you're doing your best to hold things together, and that Thunder's been nobody's horse since Thomas passed. Reverend Walsh set down his empty cup and stood. She also told him that you're not some prize to be won, but a woman trying to save her home the only way she knows how. After the Reverend left, Sarah found herself drawn to the corral where Thunder stood watching the horizon with an alertness that seemed almost human. The stallion's ears pricked forward at her approach, but he made no move to come closer. Since Thomas's death, Thunder had maintained this careful distance from everyone, as if he understood that his master's passing had changed the fundamental nature of all relationships. "I know you miss him too," Sarah said softly, resting her arms on the top rail of the corral fence. "But we can't keep living in the past, you and I. Something's got to change, or we'll both lose everything Thomas worked for." Thunder snorted and tossed his magnificent head, his black mane flowing like silk in the afternoon breeze. For a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding in his dark eyes, a recognition of their shared loss and uncertain future. Then the moment passed, and Thunder returned to his restless pacing, leaving Sarah to wonder if she'd imagined the connection entirely. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah noticed a lone rider approaching along the main road. Even at a distance, she could tell this was different from the previous challengers. There was something unhurried about his approach, something that spoke of patience rather than urgency. He sat his paint horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and his clothes, while worn, were clean and mended with care. This, Sarah realized with a quickening pulse, must be the stranger Reverend Walsh had mentioned. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A weathered face beneath a dark hat, shoulders that spoke of strength without bulk, and hands that held the reins with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that communication with a horse was a conversation, not a command. The stranger, Jake Morrison, though Sarah didn't know his name, yet rode past the McKinnon ranch without stopping, but not without looking. His gaze took in the house, the outbuildings, the corrals, and finally settled on Thunder with an attention that was different from the predatory assessments of the previous challengers. This man looked at Thunder the way Thomas used, too, with respect and genuine interest, rather than the calculating stare of someone trying to measure an opponent. As Jake Morrison continued toward town, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a stirring of possibility that she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Perhaps this stranger would be different. Perhaps he would understand what the others had not, that taming Thunder wasn't about conquest, but about trust. And perhaps, if she was very lucky, he might understand the same thing about winning her heart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a messenger from the territorial capital who looked as grim as the news he delivered. Sarah found it slipped under her door when she rose at dawn to begin her daily chores. The official seal of the First Bank of Cedar Ridge pressed into red wax that had cracked during the journey. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the cream-colored paper, though she already knew what it would contain. Mrs. Sarah McKinnon, the letter began in the bank president's careful script. This correspondence serves as final notice regarding the outstanding debts secured against the McKinnon Ranch property. As per the terms of the original loan agreement signed by your late husband, Thomas McKinnon, payment in full is required no later than October 31st, 1887. Failure to satisfy these obligations will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings and the seizure of all assets, including livestock, equipment, and real property. The letter went on to detail the exact amounts owed, figures that made Sarah's head spin and her heart sink. Even if she sold every stick of furniture in the house and every head of cattle still alive, she wouldn't have half of what the bank demanded. Thomas had borrowed against their future, betting everything on a prosperity that had never materialized. But it was the final paragraph that truly broke her heart. Hidden among the legal language was a personal note from Samuel Garrett, the bank president who had known Thomas since boyhood. Sarah, I wish there was another way. Thomas was like a brother to me, and foreclosing on his widow goes against everything I believe in. But the bank examiners are coming from Helena next month, and I can't show favoritism without risking my own position. If you can find a way to make good on these debts, you know I'll work with you. But time is running short, and miracles are in short supply these days. Sarah sank into Thomas's leather chair by the fireplace, the letter fluttering to the floor as the full weight of her situation settled upon her shoulders. She had 17 days to save everything Thomas had worked for, and no earthly idea how to do it. The few cattle remaining weren't worth enough to cover even the interest on the loans. The ranch itself was mortgaged beyond its value. Even Thunder, magnificent as he was, represented debt rather than asset. That afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen trying to decide whether to use the last of her flour for bread or save it for tomorrow, Sarah heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, she could see 3 riders coming up the path, Samuel Garrett himself, accompanied by his clerk, and another man she didn't recognize. This wasn't a social call. Sarah, Samuel said as she opened the door, his usually jovial face creased with worry. I'm sorry to bother you, but we need to discuss the situation. She invited them in, served coffee she could barely afford, and listened as Samuel explained the reality of her circumstances with the gentle precision of a doctor delivering terminal news. The bank had no choice but to foreclose. The creditors in Helena and Billings were demanding payment. Even Thunder would have to be sold to satisfy the debts. Unless, Samuel said, his eyes avoiding hers, you have some plan we haven't discussed. Sarah looked out the window at Thunder, who stood in his corral like a black statue against the afternoon sky. The stallion represented everything Thomas had dreamed, of freedom, power, the untamed spirit of the American West. He was also the only thing of real value left on the ranch, and the one thing no man had been able to claim. What if someone could tame him, Sarah asked quietly. What would Thunder be worth then? Samuel's clerk, a thin man named Peterson, who handled the bank's more delicate affairs, consulted his ledger. As a broken saddle horse, perhaps $200. As a breeding stallion of proven temperament, could be worth 1,000 or more. And the ranch debts total? $860 plus accrued interest. Sarah stood and walked to the window, her mind racing through possibilities and calculations. Thunder untamed was worthless, except as a curiosity. Thunder broken to saddle by the right man could be worth enough to save the ranch. But who was the right man? 5 wealthy suitors had already failed, and she had no reason to believe any other man would succeed where they had not. Unless the problem wasn't finding a man who could break Thunder, but finding a man Thunder would accept. "Samuel," she said, turning back to face the 3 men. "What if I offered Thunder as a prize? Not just his value, but everything that comes with him, the ranch, the remaining cattle, everything." Samuel's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Sarah, you can't be serious." "Think about it," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the plan took shape in her mind. "Thunder's been the talk of the territory since Thomas died. Every horseman for 100 miles has heard about the stallion no man can ride. What if I made it official? What if I announced that any man who could tame Thunder could have him, along with the ranch, and—" She paused, knowing the next words would change everything. "Along with my hand in marriage." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the tick of the mantel clock in the parlor. Peterson's pencil stopped moving across his ledger. Samuel's coffee cup remained frozen halfway to his lips. Even the stranger, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, leaned forward with sudden interest. "Sarah," Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you proposing to auction yourself off like livestock?" "I'm proposing to save my home the only way I can think of," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "Any man who can tame Thunder proves he understands patience, skill, and respect rather than brute force. Those are qualities I'd want in a husband anyway." The stranger cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but might I ask what makes you think any man will succeed where others have failed?" Sarah studied the man for the first time, noting his careful grooming and expensive clothes. "And you are?" "Harold Blackwood," he replied with a slight bow. "I represent certain business interests in the territorial capital. I came to Cedar Ridge specifically to discuss the possibility of purchasing Thunder from the bank after foreclosure." "Well, Mr. Blackwood, if you're interested in Thunder, you're welcome to try taming him like any other man. The difference is, if you succeed, you get more than just a horse." Harold Blackwood's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "And if I fail? Then you walk away with nothing, just like the others." Samuel set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "Sarah, I can't let you do this. Thomas would roll over in his grave if he knew I allowed you to." "Thomas is dead," Sarah interrupted, her voice harder than she intended. "And if I don't find a way to pay these debts, everything he worked for dies with him. At least this way, the ranch stays intact, and Thunder goes to a man who proves he's worthy of both." That evening, after the men had left with promises to discuss the proposal among themselves, Sarah found herself standing at Thomas's grave in the small cemetery behind the church. The wooden cross she directed bore his name and dates carved in simple letters. Thomas McKinnon, 1849, 1887, beloved husband and friend to all who knew him. "I hope you understand why I'm doing this," she whispered to the settling earth. "I can't let strangers tear apart everything you built. If Thunder chooses a man, at least I'll know he's someone special." The wind through the pine trees was her only answer, but somehow Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Thomas had always trusted Thunder's judgment about people. If the stallion accepted a man, Thomas would have accepted him too. 3 days later, Sarah stood on the steps of the Cedar Ridge Church after Sunday service and made her announcement to the assembled congregation. Her voice carried clearly across the crowd of ranchers, townspeople, and travelers who had stopped for worship and gossip in equal measure. "As most of you know, my husband Thomas left me with debts I cannot pay and a ranch I cannot manage alone. Rather than see everything he worked for sold off to strangers, I'm making an offer to any man who thinks he's worthy of the challenge." She paused, allowing the murmur of anticipation to build among the crowd. Any man who can tame Thunder, truly tame him, not just ride him once, but earn his trust and cooperation, can have my hand in marriage, along with the ranch and everything on it." The murmur exploded into excited conversation as the implications sank in. Sarah McKinnon was beautiful, the ranch was valuable despite its debts, and Thunder was legendary throughout the territory. Every unmarried man in the crowd began calculating his chances, while the married ones began recommending brothers, cousins, and friends who might be interested in such an unusual opportunity. Within a week, the first challenger arrived. Marcus Whitmore, the county's most successful rancher, came with confidence and expensive equipment. He lasted exactly 37 seconds in the corral with Thunder before the stallion sent him flying into the fence so hard that Dr. Patterson had to be summoned to check for broken bones. The second challenger, Jonathan Hartwell, brought scientific methods and mechanical restraints from back east. Thunder destroyed his contraptions and chased him clear out of the county, tearing his coat and dignity to shreds in the process. 3 more men tried and failed over the following days, each attempt drawing larger crowds from town until Sarah's desperate gamble had become the territory's most popular entertainment. She hated the spectacle, but couldn't deny the hope that flickered with each new challenger. Somewhere out there was a man who would understand Thunder the way Thomas had. She had to believe that, because the alternative was losing everything she had left in the world. As October drew toward its close and her deadline approached, Sarah began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps Thunder truly was untamable without Thomas. Perhaps her desperate plan would leave her, unmarried, homeless, and the laughingstock of the territory. Then Jake Morrison rode into Cedar Ridge on a paint horse that had seen better days, carrying nothing but a worn saddle, a few coins, and a lifetime of quiet understanding about the language horses spoke when they thought no one was listening. Jake Morrison didn't announce his intentions the way the other challengers had. While Marcus Whitmore had arrived with fanfare and Jonathan Hartwell had made speeches about modern horse training methods, Jake simply took a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and spent his first day in Cedar Ridge watching Thunder from a distance. He sat on the rail fence that bordered the McKinnon property, his weathered hands folded patiently as he observed the stallion's movements, his habits, the way he responded to different sounds and disturbances. Jake had learned long ago that understanding a horse began with watching, not touching, and Thunder was clearly a horse with a story worth understanding. The townspeople noticed this different approach. From her kitchen window, Sarah could see the stranger perched on the fence line like some patient bird of prey. But unlike the predatory stares of previous challengers, this man's attention felt respectful, almost reverent. He wasn't studying Thunder the way a buyer examines livestock. He was watching the way a reader studies a book, seeking to understand rather than to judge. "Mighty strange fellow," commented Pete Miller, the blacksmith, as he paused in his work to wipe sweat from his forehead. His shop sat close enough to the McKinnon property that he'd had a clear view of all Thunder's previous encounters with would-be tamers. "Been sitting on that fence for nigh on 4 hours now, just watching." "Maybe he's waiting for the horse to get tired," suggested Doc Patterson, who had stopped by to have his horse reshod after making his rounds to the outlying ranches. "Thunder doesn't get tired," Pete replied with the authority of a man who had shod the stallion during Thomas's lifetime. "That horse has more spirit than a whole herd of mustangs. What he needs is someone who speaks his language, not someone trying to wear him down." Jake seemed to understand this intuitively. He made no attempt to approach the corral or call attention to himself. He simply watched, occasionally pulling a small, battered harmonica from his shirt pocket and playing soft, melancholy tunes that seemed to drift across the afternoon air like smoke from a distant campfire. The harmonica had belonged to his father, a man who had taught Jake that patience was the most valuable tool a horseman could possess. The instrument itself was nothing special, just brass and wood, worn smooth by decades of handling, with dents and scratches that told the story of a hard life, honestly lived. But the music that emerged from it was something different, entirely, mournful yet hopeful, like the sound of wind through canyon walls or water running over stone. It It was the kind of music that spoke to lonely hearts and restless spirits, and Thunder's ears pricked forward each time the haunting melodies began. On his second day in town, Jake began making himself useful in small ways that seemed to have nothing to do with his interest in Thunder. He helped Mrs. Henderson repair a loose board on her front porch, refusing payment beyond a cup of coffee and a slice of her apple pie. He assisted Doc Patterson in loading medical supplies into his buggy, and when old Miguel Martinez struggled with a wagon wheel that had come loose near the general store, Jake was there with strong hands and the right tools to set things right. "Don't see many drifters who stop to help folks," observed Reverend Walsh, who had watched Jake's quiet acts of kindness with growing approval. "Most men passing through are either running from something or running towards something, too focused on their own troubles to notice others." Jake had overheard this comment while standing in line at the general store, and it made him pause in his examination of the limited selection of supplies. The Reverend wasn't wrong about men running from things. Jake Morrison had been running from his own past for the better part of 3 years. Ever since the accident that had cost him everything he thought he understood about horses and the men who worked with them. But helping others had always been second nature to Jake, even during the darkest periods of his wandering. His father had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he accomplished when people were watching, but by what he did when no one would ever know. These small acts of service weren't calculated to win favor or establish reputation. They were simply who Jake Morrison was, beneath the layers of grief and self-doubt that had driven him from his former life. The townspeople began to take notice of this quiet stranger, who seemed more interested in fixing things than breaking them. Martha Henderson mentioned to her regular boarders that Jake Morrison was the politest guest she'd had in years, always wiping his boots before entering and leaving his room neater than he'd found it. Pete Miller discovered that Jake knew his way around a forge and had actually improved the balance on a horseshoe while helping with an emergency repair. "Man works with his hands," Pete told his wife over dinner. "Got the calluses of someone who's done real labor, but also got the gentle touch you need for fine work. Reminds me of Thomas McKinnon, in some ways quiet, thoughtful, doesn't waste words." This comparison to her late husband would have meant everything to Sarah had she heard it. But she was struggling with her own complicated feelings about the stranger who spent his days watching Thunder with such patient attention. Part of her hoped he would prove different from the others, that he would succeed where wealth and arrogance had failed. But another part of her feared what success would mean marriage to a man she didn't know, built on a foundation of desperation rather than love. From her kitchen window, she found herself watching Jake almost as much as he watched Thunder. She noticed the way he sat perfectly still for hours at a time, never fidgeting or showing impatience. She saw how Thunder gradually became accustomed to his presence, no longer shying away when the stranger shifted position or reached for his harmonica. Most tellingly, she observed that Thunder had begun approaching the side of the corral closest to where Jake sat, as if the stallion was as curious about this quiet man as the man was about him. On the third day, something changed. Jake arrived at his usual spot on the fence to find Thunder already waiting, standing near the rails with an alertness that spoke of anticipation rather than wariness. For the first time since Thomas's death, the stallion seemed genuinely interested in human company. Jake acknowledged this development with the same patience he'd shown everything else. He settled into his usual position, pulled out his harmonica, and began to play a tune his father had taught him, a gentle melody that cowboys used to calm spooked cattle during thunderstorms. Thunder's ears swiveled forward, and the great horse took a step closer to the fence. Sarah, watching from her kitchen, felt her breath catch in her throat. None of the previous challengers had achieved even this small breakthrough. Marcus Whitmore's presence had made Thunder agitated and aggressive. Jonathan Hartwell's mechanical contraptions had sent the stallion into a frenzy of fear and rage. But this quiet stranger with his soft music and patient demeanor had somehow earned Thunder's curiosity, if not yet his trust. The moment stretched between man and horse like a bridge being carefully constructed. Jake continued playing, his eyes never leaving Thunder's face, reading the subtle signs of emotion and intention that most people missed entirely. Thunder moved closer still, until only the fence rails separated them, his nostrils flaring as he tested the stranger's scent for signs of threat or deception. Then Jake did something that surprised everyone watching, including Sarah. Instead of reaching out to touch Thunder or making any move that might be interpreted as aggressive, he simply nodded to the horsey, small, respectful acknowledgement of Thunder's courage in approaching and put away his harmonica. Without a word or gesture of disappointment, he climbed down from the fence and walked back toward town, leaving Thunder standing at the rails, clearly puzzled by this human who had asked for nothing and taken nothing. "Now that's interesting," murmured Doc Patterson, who had paused in his afternoon rounds to observe this latest development. "Man's got more sense than the others, I'll give him that. Knows when to advance and when to retreat." That evening, Jake Morrison sat on the front porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, cleaning his harmonica with a worn piece of cloth and thinking about tomorrow. He'd seen something in Thunder's eyes during their brief encounter, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about this human who refused to behave like all the others. Either way, it was a beginning, and Jake Morrison had learned to value small beginnings above grand gestures. The harmonica caught the last rays of sunlight as he held it up to examine his work, and for a moment Jake could almost hear his father's voice. "Son, a horse is like a locked door. Most folks try to kick it in, but the wise man looks for the key." Tomorrow, Jake would continue looking for Thunder's key, one patient note at a time. The weight of her mother's silver locket pressed against Sarah's chest as she stood at the parlor window, watching Jake Morrison begin his 4th day of patient observation. The locket had been her grandmother's before that, and her great-grandmother's before that, a chain of women who had loved deeply and lost much, each one passing down both the jewelry and the wisdom that came with surviving in a world that demanded everything from women while giving little in return. Inside the oval silver case lay a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, their faces bright with the hope that comes before life teaches its harder lessons. Sarah's mother had given her the locket on her own wedding day, along with advice that seemed more relevant now than it had 7 years ago. "Love isn't just about the heart, Sarah. It's about finding a man whose character matches his promises, whose actions speak louder than his words." Sarah had thought she understood what her mother meant when she married Thomas. He had been everything a woman could want: handsome, hard-working, gentle with animals and children, devoted to building a life together. But watching Jake Morrison's patient approach to Thunder made her realize she was witnessing a different kind of character entirely, one that didn't announce itself with grand gestures, but revealed itself through quiet consistency. The morning had brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the banker's wife and Cedar Ridge's unofficial social authority. Eleanor had arrived in her best visiting dress, carrying a basket of preserves that served as both gift and excuse for what was clearly intended to be a serious conversation. "Sarah, dear," Eleanor began once they were settled in the parlor with tea and the requisite social pleasantries, "I hope you won't mind my speaking plainly, but the whole town is talking about this arrangement you've made regarding Thunder." "I'm sure they are," Sarah replied, her tone carefully neutral. "People have always found my business fascinating. Now, don't be defensive. We're all concerned about you, that's all. This idea of marrying whoever can tame that wild horsewell, it seems rather desperate, don't you think?" Sarah set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Eleanor, I have less than 2 weeks to save my home. If that's not grounds for desperate measures, I don't know what would be. But surely there are other options. You could move back east, live with your cousins in St. Louis. You're still young and beautiful. You could make a proper marriage to a man of suitable background and means. And abandon everything Thomas worked for. Let strangers divide up his life's work like pieces of a puzzle." Sarah shook her head firmly. "This ranch isn't just property, Eleanor. It's Thomas's legacy. If Thunder chooses a man, at least I'll know the ranch goes to someone worthy of both." Eleanor leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary medicine. My dear, what if the wrong sort of man succeeds? What if some drifter or fortune hunter manages to fool that horse? You could find yourself married to a stranger who only wants your land. The words hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. The same fears had kept her awake for the past several nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering if her desperate plan would save her home or destroy her life. But watching Jake Morrison's patient approach had begun to ease some of those concerns, even as it raised new questions about what kind of man he might be. Any man who can earn Thunder's trust can't be entirely wrong, Sarah said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. After Eleanor left, trailing disapproval and well-meaning concern, Sarah found herself drawn to the front porch where she could observe Jake's daily ritual without the barrier of window glass. Today, something was different in his approach. Instead of taking his usual position on the fence, he had settled on the ground nearby, his back against a fence post, his harmonica in his hands, but silent for the moment. Thunder approached the fence more quickly than usual, his curiosity clearly outweighing his caution. The stallion stretched his neck over the top rail, his dark eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that spoke of recognition. This was no longer the wary assessment of a wild animal confronting a potential threat. This was the focused attention of a creature trying to understand something new and potentially significant. Jake began to speak then, his voice so low that Sarah had to strain to catch his words. He wasn't talking to Thunder the way most men talk to horses with commands or cajoling, or the kind of baby talk that assumed animals were simple creatures with simple needs. Instead, he spoke as one might to a grieving friend, with respect and understanding. "I know you miss him," Jake said quietly. "I can see it in the way you stand, the way you watch the house like you're waiting for him to come back. Losing someone important, well, it changes the shape of the world, doesn't it? Makes everything feel wrong somehow." Thunder's ears swiveled forward, and the great horse took another step closer to the fence. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. In all the months since Thomas's death, Thunder had never shown this kind of sustained interest in human company. Most people who approached his corral were met with suspicious snorts and defensive posturing. But Jake's quiet presence seemed to calm something in the stallion's spirit. "The thing about grief," Jake continued, his weathered hands still and patient, "is that it makes us afraid to trust again. Makes us think that if we let someone new get close, we're somehow betraying the memory of the one we lost. But I've learned something in my wandering. The dead don't want us to stop living. They want us to carry their love forward, to let it make us better rather than bitter." Sarah found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Jake's words resonated with her own struggle to move beyond Thomas's death, to find a way to honor his memory without becoming its prisoner. She had never heard a man speak about loss with such gentle understanding, such acknowledgement of the complexity of grief. Thunder extended his head further over the fence, his nostrils flaring as he tested Jake's scent. The stallion was close enough now that Jake could have reached out and touched him, but he made no such move. Instead, he simply continued talking in that same quiet, respectful tone. "Your Thomas sounds like he was a good man," Jake said. "The kind who understood that breaking a horse and earning its partnership are two different things entirely. I'm guessing he never tried to dominate you, never used force when patience would serve better. That's why you're having such a hard time with these other fellows. They don't speak your language." At this, Thunder actually nickered a soft sound of agreement that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The stallion had not made such a sound since Thomas's funeral, when Thunder had stood at the cemetery fence and called out as if searching for his missing master. Jake reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew something small, an apple, Sarah realized, though where he had gotten it in Cedar Ridge's limited marketplace was a mystery. He held it in his open palm, not offering it directly to Thunder, but simply letting the horse see and smell what he had brought. "This isn't a bribe," Jake said softly. "Just a gift between friends if you're interested. No strings attached, no expectations. Sometimes a kind gesture is just that, kindness." Thunder studied the apple for a long moment, then looked directly at Jake's face as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever the horse saw there must have satisfied him, because he stretched his neck down, and gently took the fruit from Jake's palm, his lips carefully avoiding any contact with human skin. The moment felt significant beyond its simple components: a man, a horse, and a shared apple on a cool October afternoon. But Sarah understood that she was witnessing something profound, the first real communication between Thunder and any human being since Thomas's death. Jake had accomplished in 4 days what 5 wealthy suitors had failed to achieve in weeks of increasingly desperate attempts. As Thunder crunched the apple, Jake pulled out his harmonica and began to play again, the same gentle melody he had been practicing all week. But now Thunder's response was different. Instead of merely listening, the stallion seemed to relax into the music, his head lowering and his weight shifting from a stance of alertness to one of contentment. Sarah realized she was witnessing something that transcended the simple challenge she had presented to the town. This wasn't about taming a wild horse for practical purposes. This was about 2 wounded souls recognizing something in each other, about healing and hope and the possibility that new relationships could honor rather than replace what had been lost. That evening, as Jake Morrison walked back toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, he passed Sarah's front gate. For the first time since his arrival in Cedar Ridge, he paused and touched his hat in polite acknowledgement. "Evening, Mrs. McKinnon," he said quietly. "I hope you don't mind my spending time with Thunder. He's a remarkable animal. He seems to think the same of you." Sarah replied, stepping closer to the gate. "I'm curious, where did you find an apple in Cedar Ridge? Mrs. Patterson's store hasn't had fresh fruit in weeks." Jake smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. "Bought it from a traveling peddler yesterday. Been saving it for the right moment." And today was the right moment? Today, Thunder was ready to accept a gift from a friend, Jake said simply. Yesterday, he was still deciding whether I was friend or foe. These things take time. Sarah studied his weathered face in the gathering twilight, noting the patience in his eyes and the gentleness in his weathered hands. Most men don't have that kind of time, or that kind of understanding. Most men haven't learned what I have about the price of impatience, Jake replied, and something in his tone suggested depths of experience that went far beyond horse training. "Good evening, Mrs. McKinnon. Give my regards to Thunder." As Jake disappeared into the gathering darkness, Sarah remained at her gate, her mother's locket warm against her skin and her heart lighter than it had been in months. Perhaps her desperate gamble would succeed after all. Perhaps Thunder would choose this quiet stranger with his patient ways and gentle music. And perhaps, though she barely dared to hope it, she would find that marriage to Jake Morrison might offer more than mere salvation for her ranch. The ranch deed lay spread across Sarah's kitchen table like an indictment, its legal language spelling out in precise terms everything she stood to lose. The document had been in the McKinnon family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son, with the solemnity of a sacred trust. Now it might pass to a complete stranger, or disappear entirely into the hands of bankers and creditors who saw land only as numbers in a ledger. Samuel Garrett had delivered the final paperwork himself, arriving at dawn with the reluctant efficiency of a man performing a duty he despised. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be a sleepless night spent wrestling with his conscience. "Sarah, I've done everything I can," he said, settling heavily into one of her kitchen chairs. "Delayed the paperwork as long as possible, written to every contact I have in Helena and Billings, even considered using my own savings to buy you more time. But the bank examiners arrive next week, and if I don't have this matter resolved by then, they'll remove me and foreclose anyway." Sarah poured coffee for both of them, her hands steady, despite the tremor in her voice. "How long do I have?" 5 days, October 26th. Samuel's finger traced the deadline marked in red ink at the bottom of the foreclosure notice. "If you can't satisfy the debts by then, the ranch becomes property of the First Bank of Cedar Ridge, to be sold at auction to recover our losses." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that October 26th would have been her 8th wedding anniversary with Thomas. They had planned to celebrate with a trip to Helena, maybe even to see one of the traveling shows that came through the territorial capital. Instead, She would be marking the day by losing everything they had built together. "What about Thunder?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He'll be sold separately as livestock. Best estimate is he'll bring maybe $50 at auction as an unbroken horse. The buyer will probably ship him to one of those eastern shows where they display wild western animals." Samuel's voice carried the flat tone of a man delivering news he knew would cause pain. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know what that horse meant to Thomas." After Samuel left, Sarah found herself walking through the house as if seeing it for the first time, noting details that would soon belong to strangers. The hand-carved banister Thomas had shaped from local pine. The stone fireplace they had built together during their second winter, mixing mortar and laying rocks while snow fell outside their windows. The kitchen table where they had planned their future over countless meals, dreaming of children who would never come and prosperity that had remained just beyond their reach. She paused in the doorway of what would have been the nursery, a room Thomas had optimistically built during their third year of marriage. The walls still bore the pale yellow paint they had chosen, cheerful enough for either a boy or a girl. Thomas had said with the confidence of a man who believed good things came to those who worked hard and loved deeply. The room had become Sarah's sewing space after it became clear that children were not part of God's plan for their marriage, but she had never quite managed to paint over that hopeful yellow. A knock at the front door interrupted her melancholy inventory. Through the window, she could see a well-dressed stranger standing on her porch-man in an expensive suit, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting his way. She opened the door to find herself facing a lean, sharp-featured man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. "Mrs. McKinnon?" "Harold Blackwood." He removed his hat with a flourish that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "I believe Samuel Garrett mentioned me. I represent certain business interests in the territorial capital." "Mr. Blackwood." Sarah stepped back to allow him entry, though something about his presence made her skin crawl. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, it's what I can do for you," Harold replied, his gaze taking in every detail of her parlor with the assessment of a man appraising merchandise. "I've come to make you an offer that could solve all your financial difficulties." He settled into Thomas's chair without being invited, spreading himself in the space with casual ownership that made Sarah's jaw tighten. From a leather portfolio, he withdrew a sheaf of official-looking documents. "My associates and I have been following the situation here with great interest," Harold continued. "Your late husband's debts, the challenge you've issued regarding Thunder, the upcoming foreclosure, it's all quite fascinating from a business perspective. I'm not sure I understand what you're proposing, Mr. Blackwood." "It's quite simple, really. We're prepared to pay off your debts in full, $860 plus interest in exchange for clear title to Thunder and a modest portion of your ranch land. You could keep the house and enough acreage for a small garden, live comfortably for the rest of your life without the burden of managing livestock or worrying about finances." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "And Thunder?" "Would become part of a traveling exhibition showcasing the wild creatures of the American frontier. Imagine the excitement when people in New York and Boston see a genuine, untamed mustang, perhaps even watch demonstrations of Western riding techniques. Thunder would be famous from coast to coast. As a curiosity, a prisoner." Harold's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too even. "As a valuable asset, generating substantial revenue. Mrs. McKinnon, I understand your sentimental attachment to the animal, but sentiment doesn't pay debts or put food on the table. My offer guarantees your security and gives Thunder a purpose beyond standing in a corral growing older and more bitter." Sarah stood abruptly, her decision crystallizing with Harold's callous words. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you misunderstand the nature of my challenge. Thunder isn't for sale to the highest bidder. He's for the man who can earn his trust and partnership. And if no such man exists, if your romantic notion about horse whispering proves to be merely fantasy—" Harold's tone sharpened, revealing the predator beneath his polished exterior. "Time is running short, Mrs. McKinnon. My offer won't remain open indefinitely." "Then I suggest you try your luck with Thunder, Like any other man, Mr. Blackwood. If you can tame him, you can have everything I've promised. If not, then we have nothing further to discuss." Harold's mask slipped entirely now, showing the cold ambition underneath. "Very well, but I should mention that I've had considerable experience with difficult horses. I don't believe in coddling or patience when firmness and proper technique can achieve faster results." After he left, Sarah felt the need to check on Thunder, as if Harold's presence had somehow contaminated the ranch with his mercenary intentions. She found the stallion standing at the far end of his corral, ears pinned back and nostrils flaring as he stared toward the house where Harold's scent still lingered. "You don't like him either," Sarah murmured, approaching the fence. "Smart horse." Thunder's agitation was obvious, paced restlessly, occasionally snorting and tossing his head as if trying to clear an unpleasant smell from his nostrils. Thomas had always said that horses were excellent judges of character, that they could sense things about people that humans often missed. Harold Blackwood had clearly failed Thunder's character assessment even before attempting to approach the animal. That afternoon brought Jake Morrison back to his usual spot, though today he seemed to sense Thunder's unsettled mood immediately. Instead of taking his position on the fence, Jake remained standing, his body language calm but alert as he observed the stallion's agitated state. "Something's got you stirred up," Jake said quietly. "Want to tell me about it?" Thunder's ears swiveled toward Jake's voice, and gradually the stallion's pacing slowed. Whatever comfort Jake's presence provided seemed to ease some of Thunder's distress, though the horse remained more alert than usual. Jake began to hum softly, not playing his harmonica today, but using his own voice to create the gentle melodies that had become part of their daily ritual. The humming seemed to soothe Thunder more effectively than instruments, perhaps because it was more personal, more immediately connected to the man himself. Sarah found herself drawn to the front porch, ostensibly to shake out a rug, but actually to observe this latest interaction between Jake and Thunder. She was learning to read the subtle signs of their developing relationship, the way Thunder's ears remained forward when Jake was present, the gradual decrease in the distance the horse maintained from the fence, the lengthening periods of stillness when Thunder simply stood and listened to Jake's quiet conversation. "Mrs. McKinnon?" Jake's voice carried across the yard, and Sarah realized he had noticed her watching. "Might I ask if Thunder's had any visitors today? He seems more unsettled than usual." Sarah approached the corral, noting how Thunder remained calm, even with both humans present. A man named Harold Blackwood stopped by. He seemed to think Thunder might be interested in becoming part of a traveling show. Jake's expression darkened slightly. "I see. And Thunder's opinion of Mr. Blackwood?" "About what you'd expect from a horse with good sense," Sarah replied, and was rewarded with one of Jake's rare smiles. "Horses don't lie about people," Jake said simply. "They can't afford to. Their survival depends on reading intentions accurately. If Thunder doesn't trust someone, there's usually a good reason." As if to confirm Jake's words, Thunder moved closer to the fence, positioning himself between Sarah and the direction from which Harold had approached earlier. The gesture was subtle but unmistakably a protective stance that spoke of the horse's growing comfort with both Sarah and Jake while maintaining wariness toward potential threats. "He's protecting you," Jake observed with obvious approval. "Thomas trained him well." "Thomas never trained him to be protective," Sarah said. "That's just Thunder's nature looking out for the people he cares about." Jake's eyes met hers across the fence rail, and Sarah felt something pass between theme and understanding that went beyond their shared concern for Thunder. They were both people who had lost much, who understood the value of loyalty and the rarity of trust. In Thunder's protective gesture, they recognized something of their own careful approach to new relationships, the wariness that came from having been hurt before. 5 days, Sarah said quietly, not sure why she was sharing this information with a man she barely knew. Until the bank forecloses. Until I lose everything Thomas worked for." She gestured toward the house, the barn, the corrals that represented a lifetime of dreams and sweat. "Unless someone can tame Thunder by then." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail as he studied Thunder's magnificent form. "And if someone does? If Thunder accepts a man as his partner, what then for you, Mrs. McKinnon?" "Then I honor my word and hope I've chosen my bargain wisely." Sarah's voice carried more confidence than she felt. "What about you, Mr. Morrison? Do you plan to try?" Jake's answer was immediate and certain. "Thunder will let me know when he's ready. Until then, I'm content to be his friend." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah realized that Jake Morrison's patient approach had taught her something important about her own situation. Perhaps the key to saving her ranch and her future wasn't about forcing solutions or accepting the first offer that presented itself. Perhaps it was about trust, patience, and waiting for the right moment to take the next step forward. Thunder's horseshoe hung above the barn door like a talisman, its iron surface polished smooth by Thomas's careful hands during the long winter evenings when ranch work moved indoors. Sarah had found her husband crafting it during their 4th year of marriage, heating and shaping the metal with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. When she'd asked why he was making horseshoes when Pete Miller could forge them faster and cheaper, Thomas had smiled and continued his work. "This one's special," he'd said, testing the shoe's weight and balance. "Thunder's got particular feet, and he deserves particular care." Sometimes the most important things in life are worth doing yourself, even if someone else could do them easier. Now, as Sarah stood in the barn examining the horseshoe that had never been used, Thomas had died before. Thunder needed reshoeing, she wondered if her husband had somehow known that this piece of his craftsmanship would become symbolic of everything he'd tried to teach about patience, understanding, and the bond between man and horse. The morning had brought Harold Blackwood back to the ranch, though this time he'd come prepared for action rather than negotiation. A wagon followed him up the dirt road, loaded with ropes, wooden posts, and what appeared to be some kind of mechanical contraption that Sarah didn't recognize. 2 hired men rode alongside, their faces bearing the hard expressions of men accustomed to using force when subtlety failed. "Mrs. McKinnon," Harold called out as he dismounted near the corral where Thunder stood watching the newcomers with obvious suspicion. "I've decided to accept your challenge. Today, I'll demonstrate the proper way to handle a difficult horse." Sarah emerged from the barn, Thomas's horseshoe clutched in her hand like a protective charm. "Mr. Blackwood, I should warn you that Thunder has injured several men who tried to—" "Mrs. McKinnon, please." Harold's interruption carried the condescending tone of a man explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "Those men failed because they lacked proper technique and equipment. I've spent considerable time in the Eastern riding academies, where scientific methods have replaced the crude, trial-and-error approaches common in the frontier territories." The hired men were already unloading their equipment, a complex arrangement of ropes and pulleys that Harold had apparently designed to restrain Thunder while he was being broken. The contraption looked more like something intended for capturing wild animals than for communicating with a domesticated horse, and Thunder's agitation increased visibly as the strange apparatus was assembled near his corral. "The key," Harold announced loudly enough for the small crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness his attempt, "is to establish dominance immediately. A horse must understand from the first moment that human will is superior to animal instinct. Sentiment and coddling only prolong the process and increase the danger to all involved." Jake Morrison appeared as if summoned by Thunder's distress, though Sarah hadn't seen him approach. He took his usual position at the fence, but his posture was different today, alert and ready rather than relaxed and patient. Thunder immediately moved toward Jake's side of the corral, as far from Harold's equipment as the space allowed. "Interesting," Harold observed with a thin smile. "The horse seems to have formed an attachment to the drifter. This actually works to our advantage. We can use his presence as a calming influence while we apply proper restraints." "I don't think that's what Thunder wants," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying across the corral with calm authority. Harold's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your obvious affection for the animal, but horses don't get to choose what they want. They're livestock, valuable when properly trained and dangerous when allowed to follow their instincts. Today, Thunder learns to accept human authority." What followed was a spectacle that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come, though not for the reasons Harold Blackwood had intended. The moment he entered the corral with his ropes and restraining devices, Thunder exploded into motion, not the aimless bucking and rearing that had characterized his responses to previous challenges, but focused, intelligent resistance that seemed to anticipate Harold's every move. Thunder had clearly learned from watching the failures of Marcus Whitmore, Jonathan Hartwell, and the others. He'd studied their approaches and developed countermeasures, turning each of Harold's scientific techniques against him with the tactical brilliance of a military strategist. When Harold tried to corner him using the rope system, Thunder feinted left and bolted right, leaving the would-be trainer tangled in his own equipment. When Harold attempted to use the mechanical restraints, Thunder kicked them apart with surgical precision, destroying hours of careful assembly in seconds. But it was when Harold, frustrated by his inability to control Thunder through mechanical means, picked up a whip that the real battle began. The crack of leather against air sent Thunder into a fury that was magnificent and terrible to behold. The stallion reared to his full height, his hooves pawing the air like weapons, his eyes blazing with an intelligence that was unmistakably personal. This wasn't just an animal defending itself, this was Thunder passing judgment on Harold Blackwood and finding him utterly wanting. "Get out of there!" Jake shouted, climbing over the fence with swift efficiency. He's not just angry, he's fighting for his life. Harold, either too proud or too stupid to recognize the danger he was in, raised the whip again. Thunder's response was immediate and devastating, a charge that sent Harold scrambling for the fence, his expensive clothes torn and his scientific confidence shattered. The stallion pursued him to the very edge of the corral, stopping only when Harold tumbled over the rails and landed in an undignified heap at the feet of his hired men. The silence that followed was broken only by Thunder's heavy breathing and the sound of Harold dusting off his ruined suit. The townspeople who had gathered to watch began to disperse, shaking their heads and muttering about city folks who thought they could impose their ways on Western horses. Harold's hired men were already loading the remnants of their equipment back into the wagon, clearly eager to leave before Thunder decided to continue his assault through the fence. "This isn't over." Harold snarled at Sarah as he prepared to leave. "That animal is dangerous, a threat to public safety. When I own this ranch, the first thing I'll do is have him shot." The casual cruelty of Harold's threat hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Jake stepped between them, his quiet demeanor transformed into something altogether more dangerous. "Mr. Blackwood," Jake said, his voice still soft, but carrying an undertone that made Harold take an involuntary step backward, "I think you should leave now. And I think you should reconsider any future plans that involve this ranch or this horse." There was something in Jake's tone that spoke of experiences beyond horse training, of hard lessons learned in harder places. Harold, for all his bluster and Eastern education, recognized the voice of a man who had seen violence and wasn't afraid of it. He retreated to his wagon without another word, though the look he cast toward Thunder promised that this defeat would not be forgotten or forgiven. After Harold's departure, Thunder remained agitated, pacing the corral and occasionally snorting in the direction the wagon had taken. Jake remained near the fence, speaking in low, soothing tones that gradually calmed the stallion's nerves. "He'll be back," Sarah said, approaching the corral with Thomas's horseshoe still clutched in her hand. "Maybe," Jake agreed, "but not today, and maybe not in the same way. Harold Blackwood learned something important about Thunder, that force and intimidation won't work. Question is whether he's smart enough to change his approach, or stubborn enough to try something worse." Sarah looked at the horseshoe in her hand, remembering Thomas's words about taking care of the things that mattered most. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why haven't you tried to tame Thunder yet? You've spent more time with him than anyone since Thomas died. He trusts you more than he's trusted anyone else. Why are you waiting?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail as he watched Thunder gradually return to his normal, alert calm. "Because trust isn't the same thing as partnership, Mrs. McKinnon. Thunder trusts me enough to accept my presence, maybe even my friendship. But taking that next step, asking him to accept me as his rider, his partner, that requires something more." "What?" "It requires him to believe that I'm worthy of taking Thomas's place. Not just as a rider, but as someone who understands what he meant to your husband and what he means to you." Jake's eyes met hers across the fence. "That's not something that can be rushed or forced. It has to come from Thunder himself, when he's ready to honor Thomas's memory by accepting someone new." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from grief for Thomas or hope for the future, she couldn't say. Jake Morrison understood something that Harold Blackwood and all the other challengers had missed, that taming Thunder wasn't about conquest or dominance. It was about healing, about honoring the past, while embracing the possibility of something new. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah stood at her kitchen window and watched Jake play his harmonica for Thunder one more time. The melody was different tonight, sadder, but also somehow more hopeful, like a song of mourning that gradually transformed into a lullaby of promise. Thunder stood perfectly still as the music washed over him, his magnificent head lowered and his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps her desperate gamble might succeed after all, not because someone had forced Thunder into submission, but because the right man had earned the privilege of partnership with the greatest horse she had ever known. The horseshoe grew warm in her hand as she held it, and Sarah made a silent promise to Thomas's memory. When the time came, when Thunder was ready to accept Jake as his rider, she would give Jake this horseshoe, this symbol of Thomas's love and craftsmanship, as a token of trust and hope for the future they might build together. The photograph was tucked between the pages of Jake's worn Bible, yellowed with age and creased from handling. Sarah discovered it purely by accident when a gust of wind from the open window of Mrs. Henderson's parlor caught the book's pages as Jake set it aside to help with the evening dishes. The image fluttered to the floor, landing face up at Sarah's feet like a revelation she wasn't prepared to receive. Two young men smiled back at her from the faded sepia print tone. Clearly Jake, though perhaps 10 years younger, with fewer lines around his eyes and hope still bright in his expression. The other man was so similar in appearance that Sarah's first thought was that Jake had a twin brother. Both wore the clothes of working cowboys, their arms draped around each other's shoulders, with the easy affection of siblings who had shared everything from childhood onward. "That's my brother Daniel," Jake said quietly, retrieving the photograph with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "We were partners in everything back then, shared the same dreams, worked the same ranches, even fell in love with the same girl once." Sarah had come to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house to thank Jake for his intervention during Harold Blackwood's disastrous attempt with Thunder, but now she found herself drawn into a conversation that felt more intimate than anything they had shared before. Jake settled the photograph carefully back into his Bible, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of the inscription on the back. "Jake and Danny Morrison, partners in everything, 1884. "He's not with you now," Sarah observed, noting the past tense in Jake's words and the carefully controlled grief in his voice. "No," Jake replied simply, "he's not." They were alone in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, the elderly boarding house owner having retired early with one of her persistent headaches. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as Jake settled into the worn armchair across from Sarah and began to speak in the careful tones of a man who had rarely shared his deepest pain with another soul. "Daniel and I weren't just brothers, we were the Morrison Horse Training Company. Had a reputation throughout Texas and Oklahoma for gentling the horses that other men couldn't handle. We never broke a horse in our lives, just convinced them that partnership was better than conflict." Jake's eyes grew distant, looking backward through the years to a time when the world had held more promise. Danny was the talker, the one who could charm clients and negotiate prices. I was the one who worked with the difficult animals, the ones that had been hurt or abused or just forgotten how to trust. Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn into Jake's story, despite the obvious pain it caused him to tell it. She recognized something familiar in his description of their partnership, the same division of talents that she and Thomas had shared, with Thomas handling the business aspects of ranching, while she managed the domestic sphere that kept their life running smoothly. "What happened to him?" she asked gently. Jake's hands moved to his harmonica, not to play it, but simply to hold it like a talisman against the memories he was about to share. 3 years ago, we took a contract to gentle a string of mustangs for a ranch outside Amarillo. 27 horses in all, caught wild and never handled by human hands. It was exactly the kind of challenge we specialized in, turning wild creatures into trusted partners through patience and understanding. He paused, and Sarah could see him gathering the strength to continue. Outside, the evening sounds of Cedar Ridge dogs barking, children playing, the distant sound of Pete Miller closing up his blacksmith shop seemed to fade as Jake's story drew her deeper into his painful past. "The horses were magnificent," Jake continued. "Young, strong, intelligent, everything you'd want in a working animal. But they'd been captured roughly, penned too tightly, handled by men who saw them as problems to be solved rather than spirits to be honored. Most of them were terrified, and a few were downright dangerous from fear and mistreatment." Jake stood and walked to the window, though Sarah suspected he was seeing the plains of Texas rather than the streets of Cedar Ridge. There was one stallion, a blue roan with eyes like thunder and a spirit that refused to be diminished by captivity. The ranch foreman wanted to break him with ropes and force, said the horse was too dangerous to fool around with. But Danny saw something special in that horse, same as I did. We convinced the foreman to let us try our methods first. Sarah felt a chill of premonition, understanding that this story was building toward tragedy even before Jake reached the climactic moment. The careful way he spoke, the precision with which he chose his words, suggested a man who had told this story to himself countless times, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. "We worked with that stallion for 6 weeks, Jake said, his voice growing softer as he approached the heart of his tale. "Made real progress too, got him to accept a halter, take food from our hands, even let us touch his neck and shoulders. Danny was convinced that 1 more week would see the horse ready to accept a saddle. I thought we should take more time, let the horse tell us when he was ready. But Danny was eager to prove our methods, maybe a little too eager." Jake turned from the window, his weathered face etched with the kind of pain that comes from reliving a moment that changed everything. July 15th, 1884. Danny decided to try putting a blanket on the stallion's back, just for a few seconds to test his tolerance. The horse had seemed calm, accepting all the signs were good. But something spooked him at the critical moment. Maybe a snake in the grass, maybe just a shadow that fell wrong. The stallion reared, came down twisted, and Danny got caught underneath. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She had seen horses fall before, had witnessed the devastating power of 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone moving in fear or anger. Horse accidents were a fact of life on any ranch, but that didn't make them any less tragic when they occurred. "The horse rolled right over him," Jake continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Broke Danny's back in 3 places, crushed his ribs, damaged things inside that couldn't be fixed. He lived for 2 days, long enough to make me promise that I wouldn't blame the horse. Said it wasn't the stallion's fault, that we'd pushed too hard, moved too fast. Made me swear I'd keep working with horses, not let fear or anger turn me into the kind of man who solved problems with force." Jake returned to his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I kept that promise for about 6 months. Finished the contract in Amarillo, found good homes for all the horses, including the blue roan that killed my brother. Then I started drinking, started drifting, started using my fists more than my brain when horses gave me trouble. Took me 2 years to realize I was becoming exactly the kind of man Danny had died trying to prove wrong. Sarah understood now why Jake had approached Thunder with such infinite patience, why he seemed to hear languages that other men missed, why he carried himself with the careful humility of someone who had learned the price of arrogance. His gentleness with Thunder wasn't just techniquite, was penance, a way of honoring his brother's memory by returning to the principles they had shared. The harmonica was Danny's, Jake added, pulling the instrument from his pocket. He used to play it in the evenings after we finished working with the horses. Said music calmed both animals and men, reminded everyone involved that life was about more than just survival. I haven't been able to make music the way he did, but I keep trying. Maybe that's enough. Sarah reached across the space between their chairs and gently touched Jake's hand. It's more than enough, Jake. What you've done with Thunder, the patience you've shown, Danny would be proud. I hope so, Jake replied. Because that's really why I'm here, Mrs. McKinnon. Not for the ranch or the money or even for you, much as I've come to respect and care for you. I'm here because Thunder reminds me of that blue roan stallion, magnificent, intelligent, wounded by loss, and deserving of someone who understands that healing takes time. The revelation hung between them like a bridge being constructed one careful plank at a time. Sarah realized that Jake's interest in Thunder had never been about winning a contest or claiming a prize. It had been about redemption, about proving to himself and his brother's memory that the Morrison method of horse, training based on patience, respect, and understanding, could still work in a world that seemed increasingly committed to force and shortcuts. When you try to tame Thunder, Sarah said carefully, it won't be about the challenge I issued, will it? No, Jake admitted. It'll be about whether I can earn the partnership of a horse who's lost everything he loved, using methods that honor the man who taught me that animals deserve the same respect we'd give to any other intelligent being. If I succeed, it'll mean I've finally become the horseman Danny believed I could be. If I fail, you won't fail, Sarah said with quiet conviction. Thunder sees something in you that he hasn't seen in anyone else since Thomas died. Whatever that something is, it's real and it's worthy of trust. Jake's eyes met hers across the parlor, and Sarah felt something shift between theme and understanding that went beyond their shared concern for Thunder's welfare. They were both people who had lost partners in tragedy, who carried guilt and grief like invisible scars, who had found in each other's company a reminder that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Mrs. McKinnon, Sarah, there's something else you should know, Jake said. If Thunder does accept me, if I can earn his partnership and save your ranch, it won't be because I conquered him. It'll be because he chose to trust again, chose to honor Thomas's memory by accepting someone new. That kind of trust is precious, and it comes with responsibilities. What kind of responsibilities? The responsibility to be worthy of it, to prove every day that his faith in me wasn't misplaced, to build something together that honors what came before while embracing what might come next. Jake's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the act of articulating his intentions gave them weight and substance. If Thunder chooses me, I promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life proving that his choice was right. Outside, the evening star appeared above the mountains, bright and steady in the gathering darkness. Sarah looked at Jake Morrison, this quiet, damaged man who had wandered into her life, carrying his own burden of loss and hope, and realized that her desperate gamble might succeed in ways she had never imagined. Perhaps saving her ranch was only the beginning of what they might accomplish together, two broken people and a grieving horse, learning to trust again in the wild beauty of the untamed West. 3 days, Sarah said softly. 3 days until the bank forecloses. Then I suppose it's time, Jake replied, his hand moving to the photograph in his Bible. Time to find out if Danny's little brother learned his lessons well enough to earn the partnership of the finest horse in Montana territory. Thomas's spurs caught the morning light as Sarah lifted them from the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, their silver surfaces polished to a mirror shine, despite the months they had lain unused. She had given them to Thomas on their second wedding anniversary, saving money for months to afford the intricate metalwork that featured tiny thunderclouds etched around the edges, a design that had seemed perfect for a man who rode a horse named Thunder. Now, as October 25th dawned clear and cold, Sarah knew that today would determine everything. Tomorrow was the foreclosure deadline, and Jake Morrison had finally decided that Thunder was ready to take the next step in their carefully constructed relationship. Word had spread through Cedar Ridge overnight, and people were already gathering near the McKinnon ranch, drawn by the prospect of witnessing either triumph or tragedy. Sarah found Jake sitting on the front porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, his harmonica in his hands, but silent for once. He was dressed in his cleanest clothes still, worn and mended, but spotless and pressed with the care of a man preparing for something significant. His paint horse was saddled and waiting at the hitching post, as if Jake had been ready to leave at a moment's notice until he'd decided to stay and see this through. "These belong to my husband," Sarah said, offering the spurs with hands that trembled slightly. He would have wanted Thunder's new partner to have them. Jake accepted the spurs with the reverence they deserved, turning them over in his weathered hands and examining the craftsmanship that had gone into their creation. "Are you certain, Mrs. McKinnon? These are beautiful pieces, worth more than just their silver content." "I'm certain," Sarah replied. "Thomas always said that a man's equipment should match his character. If Thunder accepts you today, then you've earned the right to wear them." Jake strapped the spurs to his boots with careful attention to their adjustment, testing their weight and balance. Thomas had been slightly larger than Jake, but the spurs fit well enough, their presence transforming Jake's appearance from that of a drifter to that of a serious horseman. The change was subtle but significant. These weren't just tools, but symbols of acceptance into a tradition that stretched back generations. The walk to the McKinnon ranch felt both endless and far too short. Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile as they made their way along the familiar path, noting the calm determination in his expression and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He showed none of the nervous energy that had characterized the previous challenges, no bravado or anxiety about the task ahead. Instead, he seemed to be entering a meditative state, preparing himself for what he knew would be as much a spiritual encounter as a physical one. Thunder was waiting for them at the corral, standing alert and magnificent in the morning sun. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. He watched Jake's approach with obvious interest, his ears pricked forward and his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to music only he could hear. A substantial crowd had gathered, nearly every adult in Cedar Ridge, plus a dozen ranchers from the surrounding territory who had ridden in specifically to witness this attempt. Pete Miller stood next to his wife near the barn, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. Doc Patterson had brought his medical bag, positioned strategically near the corral in case his services were needed. Even Reverend Walsh was present, though whether he had come to offer prayers or last rites remained unclear. "Mighty big audience for what should be a private moment between a man and a horse," Jake observed quietly. "They mean well," Sarah replied. "Most of them, anyway. Thunder's become something of a local legend since Thomas died. People want to see if the legend can have a happy ending." Jake nodded, his attention already focusing on Thunder, with the single-minded concentration of a man who understood that success would require every ounce of skill and intuition he possessed. "Has he been fed this morning?" "No. I thought you might want to offer him something yourself." "Good thinking." Jake reached into his saddlebag and withdrew an applano, the store-bought variety he had shared with Thunder weeks earlier, but a wild apple he had found during one of his solitary rides in the hills. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones you find yourself, rather than the ones you buy. The crowd fell silent as Jake approached the corral gate. Thunder moved to meet him, covering the distance with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. The horse extended his neck over the fence rail, his nostrils flaring as he tested Jake's scent for any sign of change or deception. Finding none, Thunder accepted the apple with the gentle delicacy he had shown before, though this time he allowed his lips to brush Jake's palm in a gesture that spoke of deepening trust. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice carrying the same soothing quality it had held throughout their weeks of careful courtship. "Today's different, I know. Today, we find out if we're just friends or if we can be partners." Jake spent nearly an hour standing beside the fence, simply talking to Thunder, in the quiet, conversational tone that had become their established method of communication. He spoke about the morning, about the people who had come to watch, about his own nervousness and hope. Most importantly, he spoke about Thomas acknowledging the horse's loss, honoring the relationship that had been, and asking for the privilege of building something new without diminishing what had come before. "I'm not trying to replace him," Jake said at one point, his hand resting on the top rail of the fence while Thunder stood close enough to touch. "Nobody could do that, and it wouldn't be right to try. But Thomas is gone, and you're still here, and maybe it's time to think about what comes next. Maybe it's time to trust again." Thunder's response was subtle but unmistakably, soft, nickering sound, barely audible, that spoke of recognition and possibility. Jake interpreted this as permission to enter the corral, though he did so with the careful movements of a man who understood that everything could change in an instant. The moment Jake's boots touched the ground inside the corral, Thunder's entire posture shifted. The casual friendliness of their fence-line conversations was replaced by a more formal evaluation, as if the horse were conducting a final interview for a position of critical importance. Thunder circled Jake slowly, his movements deliberate and assessing, studying the man from every angle while maintaining a distance that was respectful but wary. Jake stood perfectly still during this inspection, allowing Thunder to set the pace and terms of their interaction. He understood that this was Thunder's decision to make, that any attempt to hurry or influence the process would be interpreted as aggression or disrespect. The crowd beyond the fence seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Conversations died away, and even the children stopped their fidgeting to watch the drama unfolding in the corral. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Thunder completed his circuit and came to stand directly in front of Jake, close enough that the man could feel the horse's breath on his face. They remained that way for a long moment, two beings taking each other's measure in the ancient language that existed between humans and horses, long before words were ever spoken. Then Thunder did something that brought gasps from the watching crowd, lowered his magnificent head, and rested his forehead against Jake's chest, a gesture of submission and trust that no wild horse offered lightly. Jake's response was immediate and instinctive. His hands came up to cradle Thunder's head, his touch gentle but confident as he accepted the responsibility that came with such faith. "Thank you," Jake whispered, so quietly that only Thunder could hear. "I promise I'll be worthy of this." The next phase required equipment that Jake had prepared carefully over the previous days. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a halter knot, the heavy, restrictive kind favored by men who believed in dominance, but a light, supple piece crafted from braided leather that would sit comfortably on Thunder's head without restricting his movement or vision. Jake had made it himself during the long evenings at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, using techniques his father had taught him, and leather he had purchased with his dwindling savings. Thunder examined the halter with the same careful attention he had given Jake himself, testing its scent and allowing Jake to show him how the straps moved and adjusted. When Jake finally lifted the halter toward Thunder's head, the horse stood perfectly still, trusting Jake's movements, even though accepting the halter represented a fundamental change in their relationship. The moment the halter settled into place, Thunder transformed from a wild horse to a partner. The change was visible in his posture, his attention, his willingness to respond to Jake's subtle cues and suggestions. It was as if the physical symbol of partnership had awakened something in Thunder that had been dormant since Thomas's death, the knowledge that he belonged to someone and someone belonged to him. Jake attached a lead rope to the halter and began the delicate process of asking Thunder to move with him rather than simply near him. Each step was negotiated, each change of direction discussed in the quiet language of pressure and release that formed the foundation of all meaningful communication between humans and horses. Thunder responded with the intelligence and grace that had made him Thomas's pride, but also with a new willingness to accept Jake's guidance that spoke of genuine partnership rather than mere cooperation. The crowd beyond the fence watched in amazement as man and horse moved together with increasing harmony, their communication becoming more fluid and natural with each passing minute. This wasn't the violent struggle they had witnessed during previous attempts. This was a dance, a conversation, a meeting of minds that honored both participants. As the sun reached its zenith, Jake made the decision that would determine everything. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a saddle blanket, the same one Thomas had used, which Sarah had given him that morning, along with the spurs. Thunder's reaction to the familiar scent was immediate and emotional. The horse whinnied softly, a sound of recognition and memory that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "He remembers," she whispered to Doc Patterson, who stood beside her at the fence. "He knows that blanket." Jake placed the blanket on Thunder's back with ceremonial care, smoothing it into position while speaking quietly about Thomas, about continuity, about the bridge between past and future that they were building together. Thunder accepted the blanket without resistance, though his breathing quickened slightly as memories and expectations collided in his magnificent mind. The saddle came next. Thomas's saddle, worn smooth by years of use and shaped by countless hours in the Montana wilderness. Jake lifted it slowly, giving Thunder time to see and understand what was happening. The horse tensed slightly as the saddle settled onto his back, but he didn't move away or show signs of the panic that had characterized his responses to previous attempts. As Jake tightened the cinch with practiced hands, he felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. Success would mean salvation for Sarah, vindication for his own patient methods, and redemption for the memory of his brother Daniel. Failure would mean the loss of everything Thomas had worked for, and the destruction of Thunder's last chance to find a worthy partner. But as Jake prepared to mount Thunder for the first time, he realized that the outcome was no longer entirely in his hands. He had done everything he could to earn Thunder's trust and partnership. Now it was up to the horse to decide whether their careful courtship had built a foundation strong enough to support the next phase of their relationship. The moment had arrived. Jake gathered the reins in his left hand, placed his boot in the stirrup, and prepared to discover whether Thunder would accept him not just as a friend, but as the rider worthy of carrying on Thomas McKinnon's legacy. The lead rope lay coiled in Jake's weathered hands, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It was simple equipment, just braided leather and a brass snapbutt. In this moment, it represented the bridge between Thunder's wild past and his potential future. Jake had crafted it himself during the quiet evening hours at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, using techniques his father had taught him and patience his brother Daniel had helped him develop. Thunder stood perfectly still as Jake approached with the rope, his dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to understand the significance of what was about to happen. The halter was already in place, its supple leather resting comfortably against Thunder's magnificent head. But this next step would transform their relationship from friendship to true partnership. Jake moved with deliberate care, each gesture telegraphed in advance so Thunder could see and understand his intentions. The horse's ears remained pricked forward, a sign of interest rather than alarm, though his muscles were coiled with the readiness that came from years of survival in an unpredictable world. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had held throughout their weeks of careful courtship. "We're just taking the next step together. Nothing to fear, nothing to fight, just you and me, working as partners." The snap of the lead rope attached to the halter with a soft metallic click that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent corral. Thunder's head came up slightly at the sound, his nostrils flaring as he processed this new development, but he made no move to pull away or resist Jake's presence. Jake held the rope loosely, allowing plenty of slack so Thunder wouldn't feel trapped or controlled. The key to this moment wasn't dominance, it was communication, the subtle conversation between human and horse that had been building for weeks through patience, respect, and gradual trust. "Now comes the real test," Jake said quietly, though whether he was speaking to Thunder or to himself wasn't entirely clear. "Let's see if you're willing to follow where I lead." Jake took a small step backward, applying the gentlest possible pressure to the lead rope. For a heartbeat, Thunder remained motionless, and Jake felt his chest tighten with the possibility that he had moved too fast, asked too much too soon. Then, with the fluid grace that made him legendary throughout the territory, Thunder took a single step forward. The crowd beyond the fence released a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the magnificent stallion willingly follow Jake's guidance, moving not from force or fear, but from choice and trust. This was what Thomas had always dreamed of, seeing Thunder accepting a new partner with the same intelligent cooperation he had shown during their years together. Jake continued the exercise, asking Thunder to move forward, to halt, to turn left and right through subtle changes in pressure and body language. Each request was presented as a question rather than a command, and Thunder's responses came with the thoughtful consideration of a creature who understood that he was entering into a contract of mutual respect and responsibility. "Look at that," Pete Miller whispered to his wife, his voice thick with emotion. "That horse is thinking about every step, weighing every decision. He's not just obeying, he's choosing to cooperate." The observation was accurate. Thunder moved with the careful deliberation of an intelligent being who understood the significance of his choices. Each step forward was a decision to trust Jake's judgment. Each turn was an acknowledgement that their partnership was built on communication rather than domination. As they moved together around the corral, Jake began to introduce more complex requests. He asked Thunder to back up, to move sideways, to stand still while Jake moved around him in a circle. These were the fundamental building blocks of partnership between horse and rider, basic vocabulary that would allow them to communicate effectively under saddle. Thunder's responses were perfect, showing not just compliance, but genuine understanding of what Jake was asking. The horse seemed to anticipate Jake's requests almost before they were made, his intelligence bridging the gap between human intention and equine response. "He's reading Jake like a book," Doc Patterson observed quietly, watching his body language, his breathing, the tension in his hands. "That's not just training, that's partnership." The crowd had grown larger as word spread through Cedar Ridge that Jake Morrison was finally attempting to tame Thunder. Ranchers had ridden in from miles away, drawn by the reputation of both horse and horseman. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for better views, while women clustered near the fence with handkerchiefs, ready in case the encounter ended in tragedy rather than triumph. But there was something different about this attempt that even the casual observers could sense. Where previous challengers had approached Thunder with aggression or fear, Jake moved with the calm confidence of a man who understood that true partnership couldn't be forced or faked. His every gesture spoke of respect for Thunder's intelligence and autonomy, of recognition that the horse was choosing to cooperate rather than being compelled to submit. Jake gradually increased the complexity of their exercises, asking Thunder to respond to subtler cues and more nuanced requests. The horse rose to each challenge with evident pleasure, his ears forward and his movements increasingly fluid as their communication became more sophisticated. The lead rope became less important as their session progressed, serving more as a symbolic connection than a tool of control. Thunder followed Jake's movements with minimal guidance from the rope, responding instead to shifts in Jake's posture, changes in his breathing, and the subtle body language that formed the foundation of all meaningful communication between species. "Ready for the next step?" Jake asked, though the question was directed as much to himself as to Thunder. The horse's dark eyes seemed to reflect understanding, even anticipation, as if he too recognized that their careful preparation had built toward this moment. Jake reached into his pocket and withdrew the wild apple he had been saving not as a bribe or reward, but as a gesture of friendship between equals. Thunder accepted the gift with his usual gentle delicacy, his lips barely brushing Jake's palm as he took the fruit. The apple crunched between Thunder's powerful teeth, and for a moment the corral was filled with nothing but the sounds of eating and breathing. Then Thunder did something that made Sarah's heart skip, lowered his magnificent head and rested his forehead against Jake's chest, exactly as Thomas used to do during their quiet moments together. The gesture was so familiar, so reminiscent of the bond Thunder had shared with Thomas, that Sarah felt the past and present colliding in her chest like two trains meeting on the same track. This wasn't Jake replacing Thomas in Thunder's affections. This was Thunder choosing to honor Thomas's memory by extending trust to someone worthy of it. Jake's response was immediate and perfect. His hands came up to cradle Thunder's head, his touch firm but gentle, as he accepted the responsibility that came with such faith. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent corral. "I won't let you down." Thunder raised his head and looked directly into Jake's eyes, and in that moment everyone watching understood that something profound had just occurred. This wasn't just a man gaining the cooperation of a difficult horse. This was the beginning of a partnership that would honor the past while embracing the future. The lead rope had become unnecessary. Thunder followed Jake's movements with the eager attention of a dance partner learning new steps, his magnificent body responding to cues so subtle that most observers couldn't see them. They moved together with increasing harmony, their communication becoming more fluid and natural with each passing moment. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, Jake made the decision that would determine everything. It was time to see if Thunder would accept not just his leadership on the ground, but his presence on his back as well. The lead rope had proven that Thunder was willing to follow where Jake led. Now came the ultimate test. Would Thunder carry Jake, as he had once carried Thomas, with trust and partnership rather than mere tolerance? Jake's hand moved toward the saddle that waited nearby, and Thunder's ears pricked forward with unmistakable interest. The next few minutes would determine whether their careful courtship had built a foundation strong enough to support the weight of true partnership, or whether Thunder's trust had limits that even Jake's patient approach couldn't overcome. The simple apple in Jake's weathered palm represented more than nourishment. It was an offering of trust, a symbol of the partnership that had grown between him and Thunder over these crucial weeks. This apple was different from the others he had shared with the magnificent stallion. He had found it that morning during his pre-dawn walk in the hills, a wild fruit unmarked by human cultivation, as pure and honest as the relationship he hoped to formalize today. Thunder's approach was different this time, too. Where once he had been cautious, evaluating each gesture for signs of threat or deception, now he moved with the confident grace of a creature who had made his decision and found peace with it. His dark eyes held none of the wariness that had characterized their early interactions. Instead, they reflected the calm attention of a partner ready to begin the next phase of their journey together. Jake held the apple steady as Thunder stretched his neck forward, the horse's velvet lips brushing his palm with familiar gentleness. But this time, Thunder didn't immediately step back after taking the fruit. Instead, he remained close, his breath warm on Jake's face as he crunched the apple with obvious satisfaction. "Good boy," Jake murmured, his free hand moving slowly to rest on Thunder's neck. The horse's skin was warm and smooth beneath his palm, muscles shifting slightly under the sleek black coat as Thunder continued to eat. This simple contact, skin to skin, trust to trust, represented a bridge between species that few humans ever had the privilege to cross. Thunder finished the apple and lifted his head to look directly at Jake, and in that moment something passed between them that transcended the need for words or gestures. It was recognition, acceptance, and perhaps most importantly, a mutual agreement to move forward together into whatever came next. Jake's movements were deliberate and unhurried as he reached for Thomas's saddle, which had been waiting patiently on the fence rail throughout their groundwork. The leather was worn smooth by years of use, shaped by countless hours in the Montana wilderness, and it carried the scent of both Thomas and Thunder, a familiar aroma that spoke of partnership and shared adventure. Thunder's ears pricked forward with interest as Jake lifted the saddle, his nostrils flaring as he tested the familiar scent. The horse showed no signs of alarm or resistance, though his breathing quickened slightly as memories and expectations collided in his magnificent mind. This was the moment that would transform their relationship from friendship to true partnership, the point where Thunder would either accept Jake as his new rider or reject him despite all their careful preparation. "Easy, partner," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had held throughout their weeks of courtship. "This isn't about conquering or breaking anything. This is about building something new together, something that honors what came before while embracing what's possible." Jake placed the saddle on Thunder's back with ceremonial care, settling it into the familiar position where it had rested during Thomas's lifetime. Thunder stood perfectly still, his muscles coiled with readiness, but showing no signs of the panic or aggression that had characterized his responses to previous attempts. The weight of the saddle seemed to awaken something in Thunder, not fear, but purpose, the deep-seated knowledge that he was meant to carry a worthy partner into whatever adventures awaited. The crowd beyond the fence held its collective breath as Jake began the delicate process of securing the cinch. Each movement was telegraphed in advance, each adjustment made with the careful attention of a man who understood that one wrong move could destroy weeks of patient work. Thunder's breathing remained steady, his attention focused on Jake with the trusting intensity of a creature who had chosen to place his faith in human hands. As the cinch tightened into place, Thunder shifted his weight slightly, but made no move to buck or resist. The saddle sat on his back like it belonged there, as natural and right as sunrise over the Montana mountains. Jake ran his hands along Thunder's neck and shoulders, checking for any signs of tension or discomfort, but found only the alert readiness of a horse prepared to work. "The moment of truth," Jake whispered, gathering the reins in his left hand while placing his right hand on the saddle horn. Thomas's spurs jingled softly against his boots, Sarah's gift serving as both practical equipment and spiritual blessing for what was about to unfold. Thunder turned his head slightly to watch as Jake approached his left side, the traditional mounting position that every broken horse learned to accept. But Thunder wasn't broken, he was choosing to cooperate, and that choice made all the difference in the world. His eyes held calm intelligence rather than fearful submission, trust rather than resignation. Jake placed his left foot in the stirrup, testing Thunder's reaction to this new pressure and position. The horse remained perfectly still, though his ears swiveled back to track Jake's movements. This was the critical moment, the point where every previous challenger had either been thrown violently to the ground or had chickened out entirely. "Together," Jake said quietly, and in one smooth motion, he swung his right leg over Thunder's back and settled into the saddle. Thunder stood motionless for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, processing this new sensation of carrying a rider after months of solitude and grief. Jake remained perfectly still, allowing Thunder time to adjust to his weight and presence, making no demands or requests until the horse was ready to proceed. Then Thunder took a single step forward, not from command or coercion, but from choice. The movement was smooth and controlled, the natural gait of a horse who understood his purpose and was ready to fulfill it. Jake's touch on the reins was light as a whisper, more suggestion than direction, and Thunder responded with the intelligent cooperation that had made him Thomas's pride and joy. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Jake barely heard them. His entire focus was on the magnificent creature beneath him, on the subtle communication passing between horse and rider as they moved together around the corral. Thunder's gait was smooth and powerful, his attention divided between the path ahead and the man on his back, constantly checking to ensure they remained in harmony. They moved together as if they had been partners for years rather than minutes, Thunder responding to Jake's slightest shift in weight or touch of rein, Jake adapting his seat and balance to complement Thunder's natural movement. It was a dance as old as the relationship between human and horse, perfected through trust rather than force, partnership rather than domination. Jake guided Thunder through a series of simple maneuvers, walking, halting, turning left and right each exercise, building on the last and deepening their communication. Thunder performed each request with obvious pleasure, his ears forward and his stride confident, as he demonstrated the intelligence and training that had made him legendary throughout the territory. As they completed their circuit of the corral, Jake felt a profound sense of completion settling over him like a warm blanket. This was what Daniel had tried to teach him all those years ago, that true partnership between horse and rider wasn't about conquest, but about communication, not about breaking, but about building something beautiful together. Thunder slowed to a halt in the center of the corral, his breathing steady, and his attention focused on Jake with the satisfied concentration of a job well done. Jake dismounted with the same careful attention he had shown throughout their encounter, his boots touching the ground softly as Thunder turned to watch his movements. The moment Jake's feet were planted firmly on the earth, Thunder did something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes and sent a murmur of amazement through the watching crowd. The magnificent stallion lowered his head and gently nuzzled Jake's shoulder, a gesture of affection and acceptance that spoke more clearly than words ever could. Jake's response was immediate and heartfelt. His arms came up to encircle Thunder's neck, his weathered face pressing against the horse's warm coat as he whispered words of gratitude and promise that only Thunder could hear. They stood that way for a long moment, man and horse, partners in the truest sense, while the crowd watched in respectful silence. When Jake finally stepped back, his eyes sought Sarah's across the corral. The expression on his face was one of quiet triumph, mixed with profound humility, the look of a man who had been granted a privilege beyond his wildest dreams. He had succeeded where wealthy men, with superior equipment, had failed, not through force or cunning, but through patience, respect, and the kind of understanding that came from his own experience with loss and healing. Thunder stood beside him like a willing partner rather than a conquered animal, his magnificent head high and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a creature who had chosen his own destiny. The challenge Sarah had issued to save her ranch had been met, but more importantly, two wounded souls had found healing in their partnership with each other. The sun was approaching its zenith as Jake led Thunder toward the corral gate, their movement together as natural and harmonious as if they had been partners for years. The crowd parted respectfully as they passed, recognizing that they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple demonstration of horse training. They had seen the birth of a partnership that would honor the past while embracing the future, and in that partnership lay the hope for new beginnings in the untamed beauty of the American West. The hand-carved wedding ring gleamed softly in the lamplight as Jake turned it over in his weathered fingers, examining the intricate patterns he had etched into the wood during the long winter evenings following his successful partnership with Thunder. Made from a branch of the old oak tree that stood beside Thomas's grave, the ring represented everything Jake had come to understand about love, loss, and the courage required to begin again. 6 months had passed since that memorable October morning when Thunder had accepted Jake as his rider, saving Sarah's ranch and proving that patience could triumph where force had failed. The foreclosure notice had been torn up, the debts paid from the sale of Thunder's offspring to ranchers throughout the territory who wanted horses trained in the Morrison method. But more importantly, 3 wounded souls, Sarah, Jake, and Thunder, had found healing in their unexpected partnership. The wedding ceremony had taken place on a crisp December morning, with the entire population of Cedar Ridge in attendance, and Thunder himself serving as an unofficial witness from his place of honor near the church steps. Reverend Walsh had spoken eloquently about second chances and the mysterious ways that loss could lead to unexpected blessings, while Sarah had stood radiant in her mother's wedding dress, her eyes bright with happiness that seemed to illuminate the winter landscape. Now, as spring painted the Montana hills in shades of green and gold, Jake sat on the front porch of what had become their shared home, whittling the final details into the wooden ring that would replace the simple gold band Sarah had worn since their wedding. This new ring was meant to symbolize their journey together, the patient craftsmanship required to create something beautiful from raw material, the way love could grow from friendship when given time and proper attention. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable ease of a woman who had found her place in the world. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she leaned over to examine his handiwork, and Jake marveled once again at how natural it felt to share these quiet domestic moments with her. "Just thinking about how different everything is from what I expected when I first rode into Cedar Ridge," Jake replied, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. "I was running from my past, carrying more grief than hope, convinced that the best part of my life was behind me. And now I wake up every morning grateful for the chance to build something new while honoring what came before." Jake held up the wooden ring, admiring the way the oak's natural grain enhanced the patterns he had carved. "This ring is made from the tree that watches over Thomas's grave. Seems fitting that our marriage should be rooted in respect for what he built here." Sarah's eyes grew misty as she took the ring. Feeling its smooth warmth and examining the delicate thundercloud pattern, Jake had etched around its circumference a design that echoed the silver spurs she had given him and the bond they all shared with the magnificent horse who had brought them together. "Thomas would approve," she said softly. "He always believed that the best monuments to a life well lived were the good things that grew from its foundation. Our marriage, the way thunder has flourished under your care, the respect you've brought to his training methods, all of that honors his memory better than any headstone ever could." From the corral came the sound of gentle nickering, and they turned to see Thunder standing at the fence with his head extended toward the house, as if he could sense that they were talking about him. Beside him stood a young mare, one of 3 horses that had been brought to the ranch for training using Jake's patient methods. Word of Thunder's transformation had spread throughout the territory, and ranchers were willing to pay premium prices for horses trained with understanding rather than force. But Thunder was no longer just a symbol of successful horse training. He had become the foundation of a new kind of family. His gentle nature with the visiting horses, his protective instincts around Sarah, and his obvious contentment with their expanded household had proven that healing was possible even after the deepest losses. "I should check on the new arrivals," Jake said, rising from his chair and slipping the wooden ring into his vest pocket. "That bay gelding still seems nervous around strangers, and the owner will be back tomorrow to see how he's progressing." Sarah watched her husband walk toward the corral with the same patient confidence he brought to everything he did. Jake Morrison had become exactly the man Thunder had somehow sensed he could be: steady, gentle, successful without arrogance, prosperous without forgetting his humble beginnings. The ranch now supported not just their growing family, but also Miguel's extended relatives who had come north from Mexico seeking honest work, and Mrs. Henderson's nephew who had proven gifted with horses despite his youth. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Sarah's attention to the road, where she could see Harold Blackwood riding toward the ranch on an expensive sorrel mare. Her first instinct was wariness. Harold had made several attempts to purchase Thunder after Jake's success, each offer more aggressive than the last, but something about his posture suggested this visit would be different from the others. Harold dismounted at the hitching post with the careful movements of a man who had learned hard lessons about assuming welcome where none had been offered. His expensive clothes were dusty from the road, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors rather than in the comfort of territorial offices. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, removing his hat with genuine respect rather than the calculated charm he had displayed during previous encounters. "I hope you'll allow me a few minutes of your time." "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah replied cautiously, "what brings you back to Cedar Ridge?" "I came to apologize," Harold said simply, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility, "and to ask your husband if he might consider taking on a rather difficult student." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Student?" "Me," Harold admitted, his face flushing slightly. "I've spent the past 6 months traveling throughout the territory, observing different methods of horse training. I've seen what force accomplishes: fear, resentment, animals that obey out of terror rather than partnership. And I've seen what your husband accomplished with Thunder: genuine cooperation, respect, the kind of relationship I never believed was possible between human and horse. Jake appeared around the corner of the barn, having heard the conversation from his work with the bay gelding. Thunder followed him like a shadow, the stallion's attention focused on Harold with the wary assessment of a creature who remembered their previous encounter but was willing to reserve judgment on this new version of the man. "Mr. Blackwood," Jake said neutrally. "Sarah mentioned you wanted to speak with me." "I want to learn," Harold said, the words clearly difficult for a man accustomed to being the teacher rather than the student. "I've realized that everything I thought I knew about horses was wrong. I want to understand what you do, how you do it, why it works when everything I tried failed so completely." Jake studied Harold's face for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but found only the genuine humility of a man who had been forced to confront the limitations of his previous beliefs. "Learning what I do isn't about techniques or equipment, Mr. Blackwood. It's about changing the way you think about the relationship between human and horse." "I understand that now," Harold replied. "I've had 6 months to think about what Thunder taught me that day in the corral. I approached him like he was a problem to be solved, rather than a being to be understood. I tried to impose my will instead of earning his cooperation. Every mistake I made came from arrogance and impatience." Thunder snorted softly, as if offering commentary on Harold's self-assessment, but the sound carried curiosity rather than hostility. The great horse seemed to sense that this version of Harold Blackwood was different from the man who had threatened him with whips and mechanical restraints. "Are you willing to start over completely?" Jake asked. "To forget everything you think you know about horses and begin like a complete novice?" "Yes," Harold said without hesitation. "I'll muck stalls, repair fences, do whatever work you think I need to understand before you'll trust me near one of your horses. I have money to pay for the instruction and time to learn properly." Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah, reading the mixture of surprise and approval in her green eyes. They had both witnessed Harold's transformation from arrogant Eastern businessman to genuinely humbled student, and something about his sincerity suggested that this change might be permanent. "We'll try a month to start," Jake decided. "You'll work alongside Miguel and the other hands, learning the basics of horse care before we even discuss training. If you can prove that you understand horses as living beings rather than equipment to be operated, we'll talk about the next steps." As Harold expressed his gratitude and made arrangements to return the following week, Sarah found herself marveling at the changes that had swept through their lives since that desperate October morning when she had issued her challenge to the town. Not only had she saved her ranch and found love again, but their success had begun to change the way people throughout the territory thought about the relationship between humans and horses. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake and Sarah stood together at the corral fence, watching Thunder graze peacefully alongside the horses that had come to learn from his example. The stallion's contentment was obvious in every line of his magnificent body, from his relaxed posture to the gentle way he interacted with the younger animals. "Do you think Thomas would be proud of what we've built here?" Sarah asked, leaning against Jake's shoulder with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had found her home in the strength and gentleness of a good man. "I think Thomas would be amazed at what Thunder accomplished by choosing the right partner," Jake replied, his arm tightening around his wife's waist. "Sometimes the best gift we can give someone we've lost is to let their love make us better people." As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder approached the fence and extended his magnificent head toward them, his dark eyes reflecting the contentment of a creature who had successfully bridged the gap between past and future. Jake reached out to stroke the stallion's neck, marveling once again at the trust that had grown between them. The wooden wedding ring in Jake's pocket would be presented to Sarah tomorrow, on the anniversary of their first meeting, but tonight was for quiet appreciation of how far they had all traveled from that desperate morning when a widow's gamble had brought together a grieving horse, a wounded cowboy, and a woman who had refused to give up on the possibility of love. Thunder nickered softly, as if offering his own commentary on the life they had built together, and in that gentle sound, Sarah heard the promise of all the tomorrows still to come, filled with partnership, healing, and the wild beauty of hearts that had learned to trust again in the vast Montana territory, where dreams could still come true for those brave enough to pursue them.